In the depths of ancient Rome, beneath the streets where emperors walked and senators debated the fate of empires, there existed a hidden world of underground chambers carved into volcanic rock. These sanctuaries, known as Mithraea, housed one of antiquity's most enigmatic mystery religions, the cult of Mithras, the unconquered sun god. Within these sacred spaces, initiates gathered to participate in rituals that would remain concealed from the uninitiated for centuries, practices that scholars now recognize as bearing striking symbolic parallels to the most fundamental narratives of Western religious tradition, including the primordial story of Eden and the forbidden consumption that altered the course of human destiny. The Mithraic mysteries centered on a powerful cosmological drama depicted in countless relief sculptures throughout the Roman Empire. The central image, known as the Tauroctony, shows Mithras slaying a cosmic bull, a sacrificial act from which all life and abundance would flow. But the scene that follows this cosmic sacrifice reveals something equally profound: the banquet scene, where Mithras and Sol Invictus, the invincible sun, feast together upon the hide of the slaughtered bull. This sacred meal represented far more than simple commemoration. It symbolized the transmission of divine power, the communion between mortal and immortal, and the ritual consumption that granted initiates access to hidden knowledge about the nature of existence itself. The banquet scene in Mithraic iconography contains layers of symbolic meaning that researchers have only begun to fully appreciate. On the Fiano Romano relief, one of the most detailed representations of this sacred meal, a torchbearer points a caduceus toward the base of an altar where flames spontaneously ignite. The caduceus, an attribute of Mercury and a symbol of the psychopomp who guides souls between worlds, suggests that this ritual meal served as more than physical nourishment. It was a gateway, a transformative act that allowed human souls to transcend their earthly limitations and access divine wisdom previously forbidden to mortal understanding. This theme of forbidden consumption leading to transformation echoes powerfully through the Genesis narrative. In the Garden of Eden, the primordial humans existed in a state of innocent ignorance until the serpent, that ancient symbol of wisdom and solar regeneration found in countless Mediterranean and Near Eastern mythologies, offered them fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The act of eating, of consuming what had been prohibited by divine decree, fundamentally altered human consciousness. It opened eyes that had been closed, granted knowledge that had been withheld, and initiated humanity into a new state of existence marked by awareness of mortality, duality, and the complex moral landscape that separates humans from both animals and gods. The parallels between these narratives become even more intriguing when we examine the broader context of sacred meals in ancient mystery religions. Across the Mediterranean world, from the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece to the Osirian rites of Egypt, ritual consumption played a central role in initiatory practices. These were not merely symbolic gestures, but were understood as actual transformative acts through which the initiate died to their former self and was reborn into a new spiritual state. The consumption of sacred substances, whether bread, wine, grain mixed with water, or other ritual foods, was believed to literally incorporate divine essence into the human body, fundamentally altering the initiate's relationship with the cosmos. In Mithraism specifically, the ritual meal served multiple functions within the mystery cult's complex theological framework. Initiates would gather in the Mithraeum, arranged along benches that lined the narrow underground chamber, recreating the cosmic banquet of Mithras and Sol. They consumed bread and wine, substances that later Christianity would also adopt for its most sacred ritual, though the meanings attributed to these elements differed in crucial ways. For Mithraic initiates, the meal represented participation in the cosmic order established by Mithras's sacrifice, a periodic renewal of the covenant between the divine and human realms, and a ritual rehearsal of the soul's eventual journey through the planetary spheres to reach the realm of fixed stars beyond. The solar dimension of these mysteries cannot be overstated. Mithras was intimately associated with the sun, though the exact nature of his relationship with Sol Invictus remained one of the mysteries revealed only to higher initiates. Some scholars suggest Mithras represented the sun behind the sun, the spiritual luminary that gave power to the physical solar disk visible in the sky. Others propose that Mithras and Sol were distinct but complementary cosmic forces, with their shared meal representing the reconciliation of different aspects of divine power. What remains clear is that solar symbolism permeated every aspect of Mithraic worship, from the orientation of Mithraea to allow sunlight to penetrate at specific times of year, to the complex astrological symbolism encoded in the Tauroctony itself. This solar theology connects directly to one of the most overlooked aspects of the Genesis narrative, the Garden of Eden as a solar temple. Ancient Near Eastern gardens, particularly those associated with royalty and divinity, were designed as microcosms of the ordered cosmos, spaces where the life-giving power of the sun could be channeled and concentrated. The Tree of Life, standing at the center of Eden, has long been recognized by scholars of comparative mythology as a version of the world tree or axis mundi found in countless cultures. But this tree also functions as a solar symbol, a living connection between earth and heaven, along which divine light and power flow. The Tree of Knowledge, standing beside it, represents an alternative source of illumination, a forbidden gnosis that comes not from obedient reception of divine blessing, but from autonomous seeking and transgressive consumption. The serpent in Eden, that most maligned creature of biblical narrative, carries solar associations that the text itself hints at, but does not fully develop. In Egyptian mythology, the sun god Ra must battle the serpent Apophis each night as he travels through the underworld. Yet serpents also protect and empower solar deities. The Uraeus cobra adorns the crown of pharaohs, representing divine authority, and the burning eye of Ra himself. In Mesopotamian traditions, serpent symbolism intertwines with wisdom, healing, and the mysteries of life and death. The serpent sheds its skin and appears renewed, a perfect symbol of the solar cycle of death at dusk and rebirth at dawn. That such a creature should be the agent offering forbidden wisdom in Eden suggests layers of meaning that early interpreters, focused on establishing clear moral boundaries between obedience and transgression, may have deliberately obscured. When we examine the aftermath of Eden's forbidden meal, we find themes that resonate deeply with initiatory experiences in mystery religions. Adam and Eve's eyes are opened. They become aware of their nakedness. They hide from the divine presence. These are classic markers of initiatory transformation, the sudden awareness of one's true condition, the sense of vulnerability and exposure, the recognition that one's relationship with the sacred has fundamentally changed. In mystery cult contexts, such experiences were valued as necessary stages in spiritual development. The initiate had to die to their former ignorant self before they could be reborn as one who possessed secret knowledge. The discomfort and disorientation were not punishments but inevitable consequences of expanded consciousness. The Genesis narrative, however, frames this transformation as transgression requiring divine punishment rather than a successful initiation worthy of celebration. This reframing reveals the tension between different religious worldviews that coexisted in the ancient world. Temple-based, priest-mediated religions emphasized obedience to divine law and proper ritual observance conducted by authorized intermediaries. Mystery religions, by contrast, offered direct personal experience of the divine through initiatory transformation, often involving secret knowledge passed directly from deity to initiate without priestly mediation. The Eden story, particularly in its final canonical form, represents a victory for the temple-based worldview, establishing that autonomous seeking of divine knowledge constitutes rebellion rather than legitimate spiritual aspiration. The Mithraic initiates who partook of their sacred meal in the dim candlelit chambers beneath Roman cities were unknowingly participating in a ritual tradition that stretched back thousands of years into the mists of prehistory. The concept of a cosmic tree standing at the center of all existence, from whose substance gods and humans alike derived their being, appears in the mythological traditions of virtually every ancient civilization. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian goddess Inanna tended the hulupu tree, whose wood would eventually be fashioned into objects of power. In India, the Vedic texts describe Yggdrasil's equivalent in the Rigveda cosmology, though this figure evolved differently through different cultural transmissions. In Mesoamerica, the Maya erected their own version of the world tree, the Huacachan, a vertical axis connecting the realms of sky, earth, and underworld. These were not merely symbolic representations, but were understood as literal cosmic structures upon which all existence depended, models of reality that explained how divine power flowed from transcendent realms into the manifest world. The tree of life and the tree of knowledge in Genesis appear to derive from this same archetypal understanding of a central tree as the source and sustenance of existence. But the Genesis narrative introduces a subtle but profound modification. Rather than presenting a single unified tree as the source of all power and wisdom, it presents two trees standing side by side, with different fruits offering different forms of knowledge and consequence. This doubling of the tree represents an ancient theological dispute that echoes through multiple ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean traditions. Some mystery religions held that access to full divine wisdom required consumption of sacred substances and participation in hidden rites. The temples and priesthoods of institutionalized religion insisted that true wisdom came only through obedience to revealed law and proper ritual observance conducted by authorized authorities. The Canaanite and Phoenician mysteries, which influenced early Jewish religious thought, included worship of the sacred tree as a manifestation of the goddess Asherah. Numerous archaeological excavations have revealed figurines of the naked goddess with a tree growing from her body, or her standing beside a stylized tree that appears to emerge from her own essence. These artifacts, found throughout the Levantine region and dating to periods contemporary with or predating the composition of the Hebrew Bible, demonstrate that tree symbolism held profound significance in the religious consciousness of Israel's neighbors, and probably within early Israelite practice as well. The presence of Asherah poles in the Temple of Jerusalem itself, documented in biblical texts, suggests that tree worship and goddess veneration remained powerful forces in Israelite religious life until the later reforms of kings like Josiah sought to centralize worship of the masculine singular god YHWH. The serpent entwined around the tree, in both the Genesis narrative and in countless ancient Near Eastern representations, embodies a principle of knowledge, transformation, and regeneration that predates the moral censure placed upon it in the Hebrew text. In the Egyptian pyramid texts, the serpent represents the creative force of the universe itself, the principle by which potential becomes actual and undifferentiated chaos becomes ordered cosmos. The serpent's ability to shed its skin and emerge renewed made it a perfect symbol for cycles of death and rebirth, for the periodic destruction and renewal necessary to maintain cosmic order. In Mesopotamian texts, the serpent Tiamat represents the primordial waters from which all creation emerges. And though she is slain by the storm god Marduk in her role as adversary, her body becomes the materials from which the ordered world is constructed. Death and creation, destruction and emergence are inseparable principles, two sides of a single cosmic necessity. The moment of transgression in Eden, when the serpent convinces Eve that eating from the forbidden tree will not result in death, but rather in enlightenment, recalls the initiatory crisis present in mystery cult narratives across the ancient world. The initiate is told that participation in the mysteries will result in a kind of death, a dissolution of the ego and familiar sense of self. Yet the initiate is also promised that this death precedes rebirth into a new, spiritually elevated state. In the Eleusinian mysteries, the climactic revelation occurred in the presence of sacred grain, possibly ergot-infected grain containing psychoactive compounds, which may have induced profound visionary experiences interpreted as direct communion with the goddess Demeter herself. In other mystery traditions, the initiate would be presented with sacred objects, engage in ritual actions, or consume ritual substances that would lead to altered states of consciousness understood as temporary death and spiritual rebirth. The serpent's promise to Eve that she will not die, or more precisely, that consuming the fruit will make her, like God, knowing good and evil, echoes the promises made to mystery cult initiates that by transgressing the boundaries of ordinary consciousness and consuming forbidden knowledge, they would achieve a godlike status, a condition of expanded awareness that transcended normal human limitations. The fact that Eve is approached first and then mediates between Adam and the fruit reflects a pattern in many ancient mystery traditions where the feminine principle served as the gateway to divine wisdom. The priestesses of Delphi channeled Apollo's oracular power. The goddess Isis initiated souls into divine mysteries. The Sibyl at Cumae offered prophetic knowledge to those brave enough to seek it. Women, often associated with intuition, blood knowledge, and direct mystical experience rather than rational intellectual understanding, frequently embodied the principle of direct access to the divine. After the transgression in Eden, the narrative describes a series of consequences that at first glance appear to be pure punishment: labor, suffering, sexual shame, expulsion from paradise. Yet when we examine these consequences through the lens of ancient initiatory experience, they take on a different meaning. The increased labor and suffering that come with knowledge reflect the burden of awareness itself. The initiate who has seen the truth about the nature of existence cannot return to innocent ignorance. The sexual shame that emerges when Adam and Eve recognize their nakedness reflects the raw vulnerability that comes with genuine spiritual opening. To know oneself truly, to see one's own nature without the protective veils of ego and social convention, is to stand naked and exposed before the mysteries of existence. The expulsion from the garden represents the painful but necessary separation from the womb state of unconscious unity, a separation that must occur for genuine individual consciousness and moral agency to develop. The Mithraic mysteries encoded these same principles into their ritualistic practice. The Mithraic grades of initiation, of which there were 7, corresponded to the 7 planetary spheres through which the initiated soul must travel after death to reach the realm of fixed stars and ultimate liberation. The lowest grades involved purification and preparation. The middle grades involved confrontation with cosmic forces and the development of spiritual knowledge, and the highest grades involved mystical union with the divine principle itself. As the initiate progressed through these grades, they experienced rituals designed to simulate death, descent into underworld realms, encounters with divine and demonic powers, and finally, emergence into transcendent light. This journey mirrored the soul's journey after physical death, so that the initiated person, having rehearsed this journey in life, would be able to navigate it successfully after death. The final meal shared between Mithras and Sul represented the completion of this initiatory journey, at least in symbolic form. The initiate who participated in this ritual consumption was understood to be partaking in the eternal nourishment that sustained the cosmic order itself. The bread became not merely bread, but the substance of life force itself, the material manifestation of divine presence. The wine became not merely wine, but the liquid that flowed through the veins of the cosmos, the principle by which all separate beings remained connected in a unified whole. To consume these sacred substances was to literally incorporate into one's own body the materials of cosmic existence, to become a conscious participant in the ongoing creation and maintenance of the universe. When we compare this Mithraic understanding of the sacred meal to the Genesis account of the forbidden fruit, we encounter a profound theological paradox. In both traditions, the act of consumption transforms the consumer. In the Mithraic mysteries, this transformation is sought, celebrated, and pursued through deliberate participation in ritual. In Genesis, this transformation is presented as transgression, as violation of divine command, as the origin of human suffering and estrangement from God. Yet the practical result is strikingly similar. Consciousness is expanded, awareness is heightened, and the consumer becomes aware of realities that had been previously hidden. In both cases, there is no return to innocence, no undoing of the knowledge once it has been consumed. The story of Cain and Abel that follows immediately after the expulsion from Eden deepens this mystery of transgressive knowledge and its consequences. Cain, the agriculturalist, offers produce from the soil, the fruit of human labor and technology applied to nature. Abel, the pastoralist, offers the firstborn of his flocks, the most valuable product of animal husbandry. YHWH accepts Abel's offering, but rejects Cain's, a choice that appears arbitrary and even unjust from a modern perspective. Yet, within the context of ancient Near Eastern religious practice, this pattern makes sense. Pastoral sacrifice, the shedding of blood, the offering of the living animal, represents the older form of sacrifice that predates agriculture, the more primal connection to the sacred through the taking of life. Cain's agricultural offering represents a newer, more civilized form of religion, one based on the products of human ingenuity rather than on submission to natural powers and acceptance of primal blood sacrifice. This rejection of Cain's offering can be understood as a rejection of the agricultural revolution itself, the moment when human beings, having eaten of the tree of knowledge, began to transform nature according to their own will, rather than accepting it as given. The serpent in Eden had promised knowledge. This knowledge manifested as the ability to cultivate plants, to build civilization, to transcend simple gathering and hunting through technological innovation. But this same knowledge brought strife, inequality, and murder, as Cain, enraged at his offering's rejection, rises up and kills his brother. The biblical narrative thus links the consumption of the forbidden fruit directly to the emergence of violence, hierarchy, and civilizational conflict. It presents not merely the story of human disobedience, but a narrative explanation for why the world contains suffering, inequality, and death. Yet in the mystery traditions of the ancient world, this same knowledge, this same transformation of consciousness that knowledge brings, was understood not as a curse, but as an opportunity for spiritual advancement. The Mithric initiate who consumed the sacred meal, who transgressed the boundaries between ordinary consciousness and mystical experience, was understood to be advancing along a path toward ultimate liberation and divine union. The pain and struggle that accompanied this transformation were understood as necessary purification, the burning away of illusions and ego attachments that prevent the soul from perceiving ultimate reality. Where Genesis presents knowledge as introducing suffering into a previously perfect world, the mysteries presented knowledge as the only path through suffering toward transcendent peace and understanding. The central image of Mithraism, the scene depicted in countless relief sculptures throughout the Roman Empire, presents a moment of cosmic crisis and transformation that reveals fundamental truths about the ancient understanding of death, sacrifice, and regeneration. Mithras, the divine hero born on the winter solstice in the presence of shepherds who recognized his cosmic significance, stands over a great bull, his knee pressed into the beast's body as his dagger pierces its heart. This is no scene of simple animal slaughter for food or clothing. It is the supreme cosmic act, the sacrifice upon which all existence depends. From the bull's body as it expires in this sacred moment, life force emanates in all directions. Grain emerges from the beast's tail, wine flows from its blood. All the fertility and abundance upon which human civilization depends springs forth from this single act of divinely ordained sacrifice. Yet the sacrifice of the bull is not the ultimate mystery revealed to the highest initiates of the Mithraic cult. Beyond the tauroctony, beyond the immediate consequences of the slaying, lay a deeper cosmic truth that scholars have only recently begun to fully appreciate. The bull itself was understood as a manifestation or representative of the sun god in his descending phase, in his journey toward death and renewal. To slay the bull was to symbolically enact the death of the sun itself, the moment when divine light withdraws from the world, plunging the cosmos into darkness. This moment, which occurs literally and daily as the sun sets, and symbolically and annually as the sun reaches its nadir at the winter solstice, represents the critical transition point in the eternal cycle of cosmic becoming and dissolution. In the Zoroastrian tradition, which deeply influenced Mithraism through their shared Iranian religious heritage, the cosmos is understood as a continuous struggle between the principles of light and darkness, between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, between order and chaos. This dualistic cosmology stands in striking contrast to many Near Eastern traditions, where creation emerges from the body of a defeated chaos monster and remains dependent upon periodic ritual acts to prevent the return of chaos. In Zoroastrianism, the struggle itself is eternal and necessary. The light must periodically retreat, must allow the darkness to advance, must even undergo apparent defeat, so that the ultimate victory of light becomes meaningful and necessary. This understanding transformed the meaning of sacrifice from an act of submission to cosmic laws into an active participation in the eternal struggle for the triumph of order over disorder. Mithras, as the divine intermediary who performs this sacrifice, occupies a unique position in the cosmic drama. He is not the sun god fighting directly against the forces of darkness, but rather the agent through whom the necessary sacrifice is accomplished. Some scholars interpret the relief sculptures as showing Mithras reluctant in his sacrifice, showing him looking away from the bull even as he drives home the dagger. This reluctance suggests that the sacrifice, though necessary and cosmic in significance, carries profound consequences. The sacrifice must be made, but the maker of the sacrifice experiences something akin to tragic necessity, the burden of understanding one's role in a cosmic drama that transcends personal preference or moral qualms. The moment of the bull's death, depicted in these sculptures, is simultaneously the moment of supreme creative power. As the animal bleeds and dies, new life pours forth. The torchbearers who stand on either side of Mithras in many depictions represent witness and authentication. Their presence suggests that this sacrifice is not secret or shameful, but rather is the fundamental reality upon which all order depends. To be an initiate of Mithras was to understand this cosmic principle, to know that the universe proceeds through an eternal rhythm of death, and birth, sacrifice, and regeneration, and to find within this understanding a ground for participation in something transcendent and eternal. In Egyptian religion, the daily journey of the sun god Ra through the 12 hours of night represented a parallel cosmic drama. Each night Ra descended into the underworld realm of Duat, where he faced the serpent Apophis, embodiment of chaos and entropy. Each night was a struggle for survival, and each dawn represented a new victory, a renewal of creation itself. This was not understood as symbolic or metaphorical, but as literal cosmic reality, requiring periodic renewal through proper ritual performance. The priests of Egypt performed daily rituals in the temple sanctuaries, not merely to please the gods or maintain cosmic order in an abstract sense, but to literally participate in and contribute to the sun god's regeneration. The failure to perform these rituals was understood as potentially catastrophic, as risking the sun's failure to rise, the return of chaos, and the collapse of civilization itself. The Genesis narrative contains echoes of this same cosmological drama, though transformed through the lens of a different theological framework. The creation account in Genesis describes a universe brought into being through divine utterance, ordered and structured by divine will alone, without the necessity of ongoing sacrifice or ritual performance. Yet beneath this surface narrative lies evidence of older creation myths more consonant with the sacrificial cosmologies found throughout the ancient Near East. The image of the Spirit of God moving over the primordial waters echoes creation myths where order emerges from a primal ocean of chaos. The description of the waters being divided to create a firmament reflects Babylonian cosmology, where the sky god Anu is separated from the earth goddess Ki by the air god Enlil. Most tellingly, the serpent in the Genesis creation account bears resemblance to Tiamat, the primordial serpent of Babylonian cosmology who is slain by Marduk and whose body becomes the materials of creation. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, Marduk defeats Tiamat in a cosmic battle and fashions her corpse into the sky, earth, and sea. He creates human beings from the blood of Kingu, the monster whom Tiamat had appointed as her avenger. Creation in the Babylonian cosmos literally depends upon the death of the dragon, upon the sacrifice and dismemberment of a previously existing chaotic being. The Genesis narrative, composed by Hebrew scribes likely during or after the Babylonian exile, appears to have deliberately rewritten this cosmology to emphasize creation through divine speech rather than through violence and sacrifice. Yet the Deuteronomic historians who shaped the final form of the Hebrew Bible, despite this surface rewriting, maintained sacrificial practice as central to the Hebrew religious system. The temple at Jerusalem operated through a continuous cycle of blood sacrifice. The high priest performed daily sacrifices to maintain the people's covenant relationship with YHWH. On the Day of Atonement, the most sacred day in the Hebrew calendar, the high priest performed a ritual involving 2 goats, one designated as the Lord's lot, which was sacrificed to atone for the people's sins, and another designated as the scapegoat, upon whose head the high priest would confess all the people's transgressions before driving it into the wilderness to bear away these sins. This system of animal sacrifice in ancient Judaism shows clear structural parallels with the sacrifice of the bull in Mithraism, despite the very different theological frameworks within which these sacrifices were understood. In both cases, the death of an animal represented something larger than itself: the purification of human sin, the maintenance of cosmic order, the restoration of right relationship between human and divine realms. In both cases, the act of sacrifice was not understood as punitive or destructive, but as restorative and creative, as an act that brought needed spiritual and cosmic balance. The blood shed was not understood as waste, but as the most precious substance, as that which contained the life force, the sacred principle that animated living being. The implications of this similarity between Mithraic and Jewish sacrificial systems become more provocative when we consider the historical moment at which Christianity emerged. In the 1st century, when Jesus of Nazareth was executed and his followers interpreted his death as having redemptive significance, the temple sacrifice system was still functioning. Within perhaps 30 or 40 years of the crucifixion, the temple was destroyed by the Romans, and the entire sacrificial system ceased to function. Christianity, emerging in this context of sacrificial absence, reinterpreted the crucifixion as the ultimate sacrifice, as the moment when the eternal cosmic truth encoded in the bull sacrifice of Mithras and the sin offering in the Jewish temple reached its perfect expression. The Last Supper, the final meal Jesus shared with his disciples before his arrest and execution, functioned precisely as the sacred meal functioned in Mithraic mysteries, as a ritual incorporation of the divine life force into the participant's body through the consumption of symbolic or literal substances. Jesus identified the bread as his body and the wine as his blood, essentially claiming for himself the role that the sacrificial bull or lamb played in earlier systems. His followers would thenceforth consume these elements in his memory, would participate in a ritual that perpetually reenacted the cosmic sacrifice, would incorporate his redemptive death into their own spiritual bodies through this sacred meal. The paradox deepens when we recognize that Christianity displaced Mithraism as the official religion of the Roman Empire, yet adopted and adapted the central ritual forms that made Mithraism meaningful to millions of adherents across the Mediterranean world. The transformation from mystery cult to world religion involved not a total rejection of Mithraic practice, but rather a recontextualization of it. The sacred meal remained central. The understanding of sacrifice as cosmic redemption remained central. The interpretation of the divine figure's death as bearing redemptive significance for all humanity remained central. What changed was the theological framework. The multiplicity of deities and the complex cosmological system gave way to monotheism. The mystery tradition, accessible only to initiates, gave way to a public faith, open to all. The emphasis on Gnostic knowledge gave way to emphasis on faith and obedience. Yet within the contemplative and monastic traditions of Christianity, elements of the mystery religion continued to flourish. Christian mystics spoke of theosis, of the soul's divinization through participation in divine life. Eastern Orthodox theology, more than Western Christianity, preserved and developed the understanding that to consume the Eucharist was to participate in the life of Christ, to literally incorporate the divine into one's own being. The apophatic theology of the Desert Fathers, their understanding that ultimate truth transcends rational comprehension and can only be approached through silence, prayer, and direct mystical experience, echoes the esoteric knowledge that was central to the mystery religions. The concept of the sun god's final meal, the last feast before the ultimate transformation or death that will change everything, echoes through mythological traditions across the ancient world with remarkable consistency. In Norse mythology, the Ragnarok prophecy describes a final meal that the gods consume before the destruction of the world and its renewal. Before the final battle in which the divine and demonic forces clash for ultimate supremacy, Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, sounds the Gjallarhorn to alert all beings to the coming apocalypse. At that moment, Odin consults the head of Mimir, the repository of ancient wisdom, to understand the implications of what is about to transpire. The gods gather for a final council, a final communion of purpose, before they march toward destiny, knowing that some will fall and that the world itself will burn. In Hindu cosmology, the concept of the yugas, or cosmic ages, describes a universe that expands and contracts through vast cycles lasting millions of years. At the end of each cycle, particularly at the end of the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and spiritual decay in which we currently exist according to Hindu calculation, the god Shiva performs his cosmic dance of destruction and renewal. The universe contracts into a singularity from which it will subsequently re-emerge. This is not understood as a tragedy or a punishment, but as a necessary rhythmic process, part of the fundamental nature of existence itself. The dissolution is as necessary as the creation, and the God who oversees this dissolution is not diminished but rather exercises the highest function of divinity. What connects all these traditions is a fundamental insight, that transformation of the ultimate magnitude requires the consumption or destruction of something sacred, some precious substance or being that embodies the current cosmic order. The old order must be consumed, digested, transformed into the materials of the new order. This is not a moral transaction, not a punishment of evil or a reward of virtue, but rather a cosmic necessity as natural and inevitable as the seasons, as the cycles of day and night, as the birth and death of individual beings within the continuance of existence itself. The Eucharistic theology of Christianity, particularly as it developed in Eastern Orthodox tradition, presents a paradoxical formulation of this principle. Christ, understood as the incarnate divine principle, presents himself not merely as a teacher or example, but as a substance to be consumed. The bread and wine are understood to become, in some real sense, not merely symbolic, the body and blood of Christ. This is not understood as an act of violation or desecration, but as the most profound form of communion, the literal incorporation of the divine into the human substance through consumption. The mystery of the Eucharist encodes the principle that transformation occurs through consumption, that the sacred must enter into the depths of the human body to work its transformative power. Yet within the pre-Christian mystery traditions, this principle was understood in a broader cosmic context that the early church both adopted and deliberately obscured. The initiate who consumed the sacred meal in a Mithraic Mithraeum understood themselves to be participating in the cosmic drama itself, not merely witnessing it or commemorating it, but actively engaging with the fundamental processes by which the universe renews itself. The bread and wine or other ritual substances were understood as containing concentrated solar power, divine essence extracted from nature through ritual knowledge and priestly practice. To consume these substances was to draw into oneself the operative principles of cosmic regeneration, to become a microcosm or cell of the larger cosmic body. This understanding appears in the Hermetic texts that circulated throughout the Mediterranean world and which influenced both Jewish mysticism and early Christian theology. The Hermetic principle of correspondence, expressed in the famous aphorism, "as above, so below," posits that the processes operating in the macrocosm, in the vast universe at every scale from the planetary spheres to the farthest stars, are replicated in the microcosm of the individual human being. The human body, understood in esoteric Hermetic cosmology, contains within it a complete replica of the cosmic order. The head corresponds to the fixed stars, the heart to the sun, the liver to Jupiter, and so forth. So, to work upon the body through ritual practice, through meditation, through the consumption of specially prepared substances was understood as a form of cosmic engineering, a way of aligning the microcosm with the macrocosm and thus participating actively in the processes of universal transformation. The Kabbalah, the mystical tradition of Judaism that developed in the medieval period, but which built upon foundations reaching back into antiquity, presents a similar understanding of the relationship between the human being and the cosmos. The Tree of Life, the central diagram of Kabbalistic cosmology, presents the divine as distributed throughout multiple levels or sephirot, emanating from the highest abstract principle downward through intermediate levels until it manifests in the material world. The human being, created in the image of God, is understood as containing within their own body and consciousness a replica of this entire structure. To progress spiritually according to Kabbalistic teaching is to travel upward along the pathways of the tree of life, to ascend from material consciousness through increasingly subtle levels of awareness until one approaches the highest Sephirot, closest to the infinite divine principle. These esoteric cosmologies, while expressed in different cultural vocabularies and theological frameworks, encode a consistent understanding that the universe is not static but dynamic, that transformation occurs through fundamental principles that can be understood and engaged with, and that the human being possesses within themselves the potential to participate consciously in these universal processes rather than merely being passively subject to them. This understanding stands in contrast to the more exoteric or public versions of these same religious traditions, which tend to emphasize obedience, submission, faith, and acceptance of divine will, as expressed through institutional authorities and revealed texts. The Genesis narrative, as it stands in the canonical biblical text, represents a victory for the exoteric worldview. The emphasis falls upon obedience to divine command, upon acceptance of the limitations and mortality imposed upon humanity, upon submission to the authority structure established in the form of priesthood and covenant. Yet within this text, as scholars increasingly recognize, lie remnants and echoes of older esoteric understandings that have been partially obscured or recontextualized. The serpent, which appears as villain in the narrative, carries in its symbolism the principles of transformation, regeneration, and access to hidden knowledge. The tree of knowledge, which appears as forbidden and dangerous, represents the esoteric understanding that knowledge itself constitutes power, and that access to this power requires transgression of established boundaries. The moment at which Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit can be understood from an esoteric perspective as their consumption of the sun god's final meal, the last feast of the age of innocence, the last moment before a transformation that cannot be undone. They consume the fruit, incorporate into their own bodies the substance that contains within it knowledge itself. Their eyes open. They perceive reality as it actually is rather than as they had been permitted to imagine it. This is understood not as punishment, but as initiatory transformation, the death of the innocent self and the birth of the conscious self. The pain and struggle that follow are understood not as vindictive divine punishment, but as the inevitable consequences of consciousness itself, the burden that awareness carries. The connection to solar symbolism becomes explicit when we recognize that the fruit itself, in many Mediterranean contexts, including the Levantine region where Genesis was composed, was associated with solar imagery. The apple, the pomegranate, and other fruit were understood as miniatures of the sun, as containing within them the generative and life-giving principles that the sun represented. To consume the fruit was, in esoteric terms, to consume the sun itself, to incorporate solar power and knowledge into the human body. The serpent, as guardian of this fruit, becomes in this reading not a villain, but rather an initiatory teacher, a being that possesses the knowledge necessary to access solar wisdom, and that offers this knowledge to those brave or desperate enough to transgress the established boundaries. In the Mithraic mysteries, the final cosmic revelation available to the highest initiates involved an understanding of Mithras himself as a solar principle that transcends the merely physical sun. The sun visible in the sky was understood as a manifestation or garment of a more subtle solar principle operating behind and through it. This esoteric sun, this spiritual luminary, was understood as identical with the creative principle itself, with the absolute power that generates and sustains all existence. To achieve communion with this principle through the rituals of increasing initiation was to move progressively closer to the source of all being. The sacred meal consumed by the highest initiates was understood as consisting not merely of physical bread and wine, but of the direct presence of this solar principle transmitted through the consecrated substances and ingested into the very center of the initiate's being. The phrase attributed to Jesus in the gospel traditions, "I am the bread of life," takes on additional resonance when understood within this context. Jesus presents himself not as a moral teacher or even as an ethical exemplar, but as the very principle of divine sustenance itself, as the spiritual nourishment upon which human beings depend for their deepest fulfillment. To consume him, to incorporate him into oneself through the Eucharistic meal, is to align oneself with this principle of divine nourishment, to become a being sustained not by ordinary bread, but by the presence of the divine within the human. The identification of Christ with the Son in early Christian theology becomes explicitly clear in texts like the Epistle of Barnabas, which speaks of Christ rising in the heart like the rising of the sun, and in the development of Christmas as a Christian feast, on the date formally celebrated as the birthday of the Son, God Sol Invictus. The esoteric interpretation of the crucifixion focuses not primarily on Christ's suffering as expiation for human sin, though this became the dominant theological interpretation, but rather on the crucifixion as the ultimate initiation, the final transformation of the human form into divine substance. The cross itself, understood as a symbol of the intersection of vertical and horizontal principles, the meeting point of heaven and earth, represents the axis mundi, or cosmic center. To be crucified upon this cross is to be positioned at the still point of the turning world, to stand at the intersection where all opposites meet and are transcended. The blood that flows from the crucified figure does not drain away, but rather becomes, through a process understood in Hermetic alchemy as a great work, the substance that nourishes and transforms all who partake of it. This esoteric interpretation found expression in the medieval mystical theology of figures like Meister Eckhart, who spoke of the soul's union with God through the stripping away of all individual will and the complete surrender to divine action. Eckhart's teachings, which emphasized the possibility of direct mystical experience of the divine beyond the mediation of institutional church authority, provoked suspicion from ecclesiastical authorities precisely because they preserved and developed these esoteric dimensions of Christianity. Similarly, the contemplative traditions of Christianity, particularly in the Eastern Orthodox Church, maintained practices of hesychasm, a form of meditative prayer that combined physical techniques, breathing practices, and visualization with the invocation of the name of Jesus, seeking to cultivate direct mystical experience and the vision of divine light. The final implication of this esoteric understanding of the sun god's final meal, whether in the form of the Mithraic ritual, the Jewish temple sacrifice, the Christian Eucharist, or the forbidden fruit of Eden, is that these are not merely historical or theological matters, but rather describe fundamental processes that remain operative within the cosmos at all times. The sun continues to set and rise each day, performing its cosmic sacrifice and resurrection. The seasons continue to turn through their eternal cycle. The individual human being, in each moment of consciousness and transformation, participates in the same processes that the ancient myths describe. To understand this, to consciously participate in these processes rather than being merely subject to them, is to access the hidden knowledge that the serpent offered in Eden, the secret mysteries that were revealed to Mithraic initiates in their underground sanctuaries, the gnosis that mystical Christianity attempted to preserve within its contemplative traditions. Among all the mysteries of antiquity, the Eleusinian mysteries held perhaps the most central place in the religious and spiritual life of ancient Greece. For nearly 2,000 years, from approximately the 16th century before the Common Era until the late 4th century of the Common Era, initiates from across the Mediterranean world traveled to the sanctuary at Eleusis, a small town in Attica near Athens, to participate in rituals that they were bound by sacred oath never to reveal. The few descriptions that survived from those who violated this oath to speak with later writers provide tantalizing glimpses of a mystery tradition centered fundamentally on agriculture, on the cycle of grain cultivation, on death and rebirth enacted through the fate of a grain of wheat. The Mistai, as the initiates were called, entered the great telesterion, or hall of initiation, and within that sacred space they were shown something, were told something, were made to experience something that transformed their understanding of death, the afterlife, and the meaning of human existence. The central myth of the Eleusinian mysteries tells the story of Demeter, the goddess of grain and agriculture, and her daughter Persephone, also called Kore, the maiden. Persephone was abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld and the dead, and carried into the realm beneath the earth where she became his queen. Demeter, grief-stricken at the loss of her daughter, withdrew her blessing from the earth. The fields ceased to produce grain, famine spread across the land, and humanity faced starvation and extinction. The other gods, seeing that their worship and sacrificial offerings depended upon human survival, intervened to negotiate a compromise. Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld as Hades is consort and part of the year in the upper world with her mother. This arrangement, according to the Eleusinian myth, explains the cycle of seasons. When Persephone dwells below, the earth lies fallow and barren. When she returns, the grain grows, and the earth produces abundance. This myth, on its surface, appears to explain the agricultural cycles upon which human civilization depends through a story of divine family drama. But the initiation rites of Eleusis encoded a much deeper understanding within this surface narrative. The grain itself represented the goddess and her daughter. The grain kernel must be buried in the earth, must undergo a process of death and dissolution, must descend into darkness before it can germinate, grow, and eventually be harvested as the mature plant-bearing seed for the next cycle. To witness this process, to see and touch the sacred grain in the initiation chamber, was to understand viscerally and immediately that death is not a final ending, but rather a necessary stage in a cycle that includes renewal and life. The initiate who has seen the sacred grain, who understands the grain's death as the precondition for the grain's resurrection, has been reborn into a new understanding of their own mortality and the possibility of life beyond death. The Orphic Mysteries, another mystery tradition that shared some elements with Eleusinianism and which predated it or developed in parallel, similarly centered on themes of death and rebirth, but encoded these themes through the figure of the god Dionysus, also known as Bacchus. Dionysus embodied the principle of divine intoxication, ecstatic experience, and the dissolution of individual ego boundaries through ritual consumption of sacred substances and participation in ecstatic ritual. The Orphic myth describes how Dionysus was torn apart and consumed by the Titans, how the goddess Athena rescued his heart and gave it to Zeus, who incorporated it into a new form of Dionysus. The initiated devotee, through the ritual consumption of sacred substances and the experience of ecstatic trance states, was understood to participate in this death and rebirth of the god, to literally incorporate the divine principle into themselves through a process of ritual consumption that, like the Eucharist, blurred the boundaries between food, substance, and divine presence. The details of what was revealed in the Holy of Holies at Eleusis, in the inner sanctum where only the highest initiates were admitted, remain uncertain because those who witnessed it maintained their oath of silence, even unto death. Yet the fragments we possess suggest a revelation centered on the sacred grain. The scholiast Hippolytus described the Eleusinian revelation simply, "They show the holy things, saying the words, 'A mighty sacred object has been born. Brimo has given birth to Brimo.'" Brimo, meaning wrathful one, appears to refer to both mother and daughter, both Demeter and Persephone, in the Eleusinian cosmology. The sacred object that is shown is likely the kernel of grain, the concentrated life force from which all nourishment springs. The revelation that Brimo has given birth to Brimo, that the mother has become the daughter, and the daughter has become the mother through the process of grain cultivation and harvest, expresses the esoteric understanding that death and life are manifestations of a single principle, that the distinction between them is not absolute, but rather represents different phases of an eternal process. In agricultural civilizations throughout the ancient world, this symbolism of the grain acquired profound spiritual and mystical significance. The grain plant growing from a kernel that falls into the earth and appears to die, only to emerge transformed and multiplied into the mature plant bearing many kernels, provided a living model of death and resurrection accessible to observation by any farmer. Yet within the mystery tradition, this observation was transformed into mystical experience and religious revelation. The initiate who consumed bread or grain products that had been specially consecrated in the mystery ritual would have been consuming not merely physical nourishment, but was understood to be incorporating into their own body the principle of death and resurrection, manifest in the grain. The bread was understood not as inert matter, but as containing within it the living power of the goddess herself, the divine principle that animates the cycle of growth and decay, death and renewal. This understanding illuminates the practice of sacred meals in the Mithric mysteries in a new light. The bread and wine consumed by Mithric initiates in their ritual reenactment of the banquet between Mithras and Sol were understood as products of agriculture, as fruits of the earth and human labor transformed through cultivation. Yet they also carried solar significance. The grain grows through the action of the sun, requires the sun's warmth and light to transform from seed into mature plant. To consume bread consecrated in a mystery ritual was thus to consume solidified sunlight, to incorporate into oneself the concentrated power of the sun as it manifests through the medium of grain. The wine, similarly, represented the fermented juice of the grape, the solar fruit transformed through fermentation into an intoxicating liquid that could alter consciousness and create conditions for mystical experience and communion with the divine. The Canaanite and Phoenician mysteries, which influenced Hebrew religious practice and which appear to underlie certain esoteric practices within Judaism, similarly centered on the cultivation of grain and the cycle of seasons. The god Baal was understood as a god of grain and fertility, while his consort Asherah represented the sacred feminine principle and the tree as embodiment of divine creativity and generative power. The dying god myth, present in various forms throughout Mediterranean religions, described how the god dies at harvest when the grain is reaped, remains dead during the fallow period, and is reborn as the grain germinates in spring. The ritual consumption of the god's body, enacted through the eating of bread and participation in sacred meals, was understood as a way of maintaining the community's connection with the divine principle that animated the cycles of nature. In the Hebrew Bible, this agricultural mythology appears in transformed and often suppressed form. The first fruits offerings brought to the temple represented the first ripened grain and produce of the harvest, offered to YHWH before the produce could be consumed by the people. This practice parallels the first fruit offerings made in Mediterranean mystery religions, where the first produce of the harvest was understood as belonging to the goddess or god who had made the harvest possible. The practice of bringing barley or wheat to the temple represented a recognition that the fertility of the land, the continuation of human sustenance, depended upon divine blessing and required the maintenance of proper ritual relationship with the divine through the offering of the most precious produce. The matzah or unleavened bread consumed during Passover carries agricultural symbolism rooted in pre-Israelite mystery traditions. The prohibition against eating leavened bread during Passover, the festival commemorating the Exodus from Egypt, appears to derive historically from an older agricultural festival marking the beginning of the barley harvest. The use of unleavened bread may relate to the use of flour made from the new grain before fermentation processes were complete, or it may reference an earlier mystery tradition in which the grain itself in its most essential and unadorned form carried sacred significance. The connection between liberation and the consumption of unleavened bread suggests that the bread itself was understood as embodying the principle of liberation, of the soul's release from bondage and entry into freedom. The blood and wine consumed in these rituals carried equally profound significance. Wine produced through the fermentation of grapes represents the transformation of fruit into an intoxicating substance capable of altering consciousness and creating conditions for mystical experience. The fermentation process, understood in ancient times as analogous to decomposition and death, was seen as a form of death and resurrection. The grape dies, undergoes transformation, and re-emerges as wine. In Mediterranean mystery religions, wine consumption was often understood as participation in the god's state of intoxication and ecstatic experience. The god, understood as filled with divine madness, experiencing the dissolution of normal consciousness in the presence of overwhelming divine reality, transmitted this state to those who consumed the sacred wine. Dionysian revels, Bacchanalian rites, and other wine-scented rituals in the Mediterranean world encoded this understanding that altered states of consciousness represented an access point to divine reality. In the Mithraic mysteries, the correlation between astronomical phenomena and agricultural cycles provided another layer of meaning to the rituals of death and renewal. Mithras was understood as born on the winter solstice, the moment when the sun reaches its nadir and begins its return. The birthday of Mithras, celebrated on December 25th in the Roman calendar, marked the moment when the sun's cycle of apparent death and decline reversed into growth and renewal. The consumption of the sacred meal at this moment was understood as a participation in the cosmic turning point where light triumphed over darkness, where the growth that would eventually bring the harvest was beginning to establish itself. The Mithraic calendar, with its observances tied to the solstices and equinoxes, encoded the astronomical realities upon which agriculture depended and which the mystery tradition invested with spiritual meaning. This astronomical perspective on sacred meals and ritual consumption reveals another layer of connection between the Genesis narrative and the mystery traditions. The serpent, portrayed as crawling upon the earth after its transgression in the garden, represents the earth serpent, the principle of terrestrial life dependent upon seasons and cycles. The serpent, associated with the earth element and with knowledge of medicinal and poisonous plants, represents the earth's own intelligence and its gifts of nourishment and danger. That the serpent offers fruit from a tree indicates that this tree, like all fruit-bearing trees, exists within the seasonal cycle, undergoes periods of growth and dormancy, produces its fruit at particular times governed by celestial cycles. The recognition of this timing, this knowledge of when and how to consume what the earth provides, requires the kind of knowledge that the serpent possesses, knowledge rooted in observation of natural cycles and understanding of the earth's generative processes. The consumption of the forbidden fruit, understood in this agricultural context, becomes an act of deliberate participation in the earth's own processes rather than passive acceptance of divine provision. The humans, in consuming the fruit, align themselves with the earth's regenerative cycles, with the principle by which life emerges from apparent death through the mediation of seed and season. This action represents the awakening of human consciousness to the processes underlying their own existence, the recognition that they are not separate from nature, but are embedded within nature's cycles, dependent upon these cycles, and capable of consciously participating in and leveraging these cycles through knowledge and deliberate action. The agricultural basis of all Mediterranean mystery religions reveals a fundamental truth that later theological development often obscured, that the ultimate reality which these religions sought to access and commune with was not abstract or purely spiritual, but was intimately connected to the actual processes by which human beings maintained their physical existence through food. The grain that humans consumed for physical sustenance was understood as containing within it divine presence and power. To eat was thus always an act of communion, a ritual consumption even in its most ordinary form. The mystery tradition took this implicit reality and made it explicit, creating elaborate rituals that elevated ordinary consumption into conscious participation in cosmic and divine processes. The mysteries taught that human beings were not merely fed by grain and food, but that they could align themselves consciously with the processes by which grain came to be, could participate in and support these processes through appropriate ritual action, and could thus become co-workers with the gods in the maintenance of cosmic order. The final revelation available to the highest initiates of the Mithraic mysteries concerned an understanding of the cosmos that transcended the visible celestial mechanics and penetrated to what was understood as the true operative principle underlying all manifestation. The 7 grades of Mithraic initiation corresponded not merely to the 7 known planets, but to 7 levels of reality or states of consciousness through which the initiated soul must pass to achieve liberation. Each initiation involved a ritual death and descent into underworld realms where the initiate confronted cosmic forces, powers that existed at levels of reality beyond ordinary perception. Yet these were not understood as merely subjective visionary experiences or psychological phenomena, but as encounters with actual cosmic entities and principles that had objective reality, independent of any individual, is perception of them. The initiate who successfully navigated these descents emerged transformed, carrying into ordinary consciousness knowledge of realities that transcended the material world and ordinary sensory perception. The highest initiation, the gradum patris or degree of father, involved an understanding of the cosmos as animated throughout, by a single unified principle that expressed itself through all the diversity of creation. This principle was sometimes understood as Mithras himself in his transcendent form, sometimes as an even more abstract principle beyond individuation or form, sometimes as the harmonious motion of the celestial spheres themselves. The sacred meal consumed by those who had attained this highest degree was understood as incorporating into oneself not merely the symbolic substances of bread and wine, but the actual substance of this unified cosmic principle. The initiate who achieved this state was understood to have transcended the necessity of dying at the end of life, to have achieved a form of immortality through direct participation in the eternal cosmic principle. Their soul, at the moment of bodily death, would ascend through the planetary spheres directly to the eighth sphere beyond the planets, the realm of fixed stars, where the liberated soul would dwell in eternal communion with the cosmic principle. This cosmological understanding that the soul must ascend through planetary spheres to achieve liberation appears in numerous ancient traditions and may represent a common spiritual insight rather than simple cultural diffusion. In Kabbalistic cosmology, the soul's ascent through the Sephirot of the Tree of Life represents a journey through increasingly subtle planes of reality until the soul reaches Keter the crown, the highest sephira closest to the infinite divine principle. In Neoplatonic philosophy, which developed partly under influence from Middle Eastern mystery traditions and which influenced both Islamic and Jewish mystical thought, the soul's ascent through the hierarchy of being from matter through soul to pure intellect to the One represents the soul's return journey toward its ultimate source. In shamanic traditions across Siberia and Central Asia, the shaman's ecstatic journeys involve ascending through the layers of the world tree, passing through the sky realm and the celestial vault, to reach the highest heaven where the supreme deity dwells. What ties these seemingly disparate traditions together is the understanding that reality consists of multiple levels or planes, that the physical material world accessible to ordinary sense perception represents only the lowest level of a vast hierarchy of existence, and that the human being contains within themselves the potential to access and perceive these higher levels of reality. This perception requires training, often encoding specific practices transmitted within mystery traditions or shamanic lineages. The practices might involve fasting, meditation, ritual consumption of psychoactive plant materials, sacred music and rhythm, sensory deprivation, or intense emotional experiences. The purpose of these practices is consistent across traditions, to shift consciousness from its ordinary material-focused state into higher states of awareness, capable of perceiving realities beyond the material. Those who achieve such states consistently report encountering beings of light, experiencing overwhelming feelings of unity and love, perceiving the interconnectedness of all existence, and understanding that consciousness itself, rather than being a mere byproduct of material brain function, appears to be the fundamental ground of all reality. The figure of Sophia, the divine wisdom goddess, who appears prominently in Gnostic Christianity and who has roots reaching back into earlier mystery traditions, represents this principle of higher consciousness, accessing and transmitting knowledge beyond the reach of ordinary material perception. In Gnostic cosmology, Sophia dwells in the pleroma, the realm of fullness and divine light, yet she also descends into the material world to awaken and redeem fallen souls trapped in ignorance and illusion. The Gnostic initiate, receiving the gnosis or knowledge transmitted by Sophia, awakens to the true nature of reality and their own true nature as a divine spark imprisoned in matter, and through this awakening becomes capable of liberation. The serpent in the garden, in Gnostic reinterpretation, is understood not as a tempter or deceiver, but as the agent of Sophia, offering the knowledge necessary for consciousness and liberation. The God of the Old Testament, who forbids access to the Tree of Knowledge, is reinterpreted as the demiurge, a lower cosmic power who seeks to maintain human ignorance and subservience rather than as the true supreme divine principle. This Gnostic reinterpretation of the Genesis narrative, though condemned as heretical by Orthodox Christianity, preserves themes that likely derive from older mystery traditions that influenced early Christianity. The idea that the material world is not the creation of the supreme divine principle, but rather of a lower power, that human beings contain within themselves divine sparks that the material powers seek to keep enslaved. That knowledge and awakening, rather than faith and obedience, constitute the path to liberation. These ideas appear in various forms across mystery traditions and suggest a fundamental alternative to the temple-based institutional religious system. Rather than seeking salvation through proper observance of institutional rituals performed by authorized priests, the mystery tradition offered the possibility of direct mystical experience and transformation available to individuals willing to undergo initiatory training. The astrological understanding that permeated ancient mystery religions encoded a similar esoteric vision of reality. The planets were understood not merely as physical celestial bodies, but as manifestations of archetypal principles or cosmic powers that influenced all beings dwelling within their spheres. Saturn represented the principle of limitation and necessity. Jupiter represented the principle of expansion and grace. Mars represented the principle of will and conflict, and so forth. Human consciousness and personality were understood as configurations of these planetary principles, as the individual soul descended through the planetary spheres to take on the qualities associated with each sphere before finally incarnating in material form. At death, the soul would need to navigate back through these same planetary spheres, shedding the qualities associated with each sphere as it ascended until it reached the realm of fixed stars. The initiate who had been trained in the mysteries would have been given knowledge of how to navigate these journeys, passwords or sacred names to invoke at each stage, understanding of the particular powers encountered at each level, and how to relate to them appropriately. This astrological cosmology appears to underlie the structure of the Genesis narrative in ways that have received little scholarly attention. The 6 days of creation followed by a 7th day of rest correspond to the 7 planetary spheres and the fixed stars or 8th sphere. The Garden of Eden, positioned as the locus of ultimate reality at the beginning of the creation narrative, represents the pleroma or spiritual realm beyond the 7 planetary spheres. The descent from this realm into ordinary consciousness, marked by the eating of the forbidden fruit and expulsion from the garden, represents the descent of the soul through the planetary spheres to incarnation in matter. The subsequent human history narrated in the Hebrew Bible, with its cycles of covenant and transgression, blessing and curse, represents the soul's journey through these planetary influences, seeking to return to the garden, to reascend to the spiritual realm from which it descended. In this light, the sun god's final meal takes on additional significance. The sun, understood as the luminary at the center of the planetary system, represents the balance point or heart of the cosmos, the point where the ascending and descending currents of creation meet. The sun's journey through the zodiac over the course of a year represents the cosmic soul's journey through the various archetypal principles or states of being represented by each zodiacal sign. At the winter solstice, when the sun reaches its nadir and appears to die before its resurrection, the cosmos reaches its critical turning point. The consumption of the sacred meal at this moment represents participation in this cosmic turning point, the incorporation into oneself of the concentrated solar power, at the moment when this power must transform from waning to waxing, from descent to ascent. The concept of the Omega point, developed by the modern philosopher and Jesuit theologian Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, represents a 20th century articulation of this ancient cosmic principle. Teilhard proposed that the universe is not a static mechanism, but rather a living, evolving process that is drawn toward an ultimate point of supreme complexity and consciousness that he called the Omega point. At this point, the universe achieves supreme self-consciousness, and the separation between individual consciousness and universal consciousness dissolves. All matter, having evolved through progressively more complex forms of life and consciousness, finally converges into this point of maximum complexity and integration. Teilhard saw the evolution of consciousness as the driving force of cosmic development and understood the universe as fundamentally oriented toward the production of ever greater consciousness. His vision, though expressed in contemporary philosophical language, essentially articulates the same insight encoded in ancient mystery traditions, that consciousness is the fundamental orientation of cosmic development, that individual humans participate in this cosmic process, and that the ultimate goal of existence is the achievement of supreme consciousness and unity. The implications of this understanding for the Genesis narrative are profound. The eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge represents the first emergence of self-conscious awareness in the cosmos, the awakening of consciousness in matter, the moment when the universe begins to know itself. This is not a fall in the sense of a tragedy or punishment, but rather represents the inevitable and necessary emergence of consciousness from unconsciousness. The suffering that accompanies this awakening, the awareness of sexuality, mortality, good and evil, labor and struggle, represents the inevitable burdens that consciousness carries. Yet these burdens are also the prerequisites for further development and evolution. Without death, there would be no impetus for change or growth. Without the knowledge of good and evil, there would be no moral development or spiritual choice. Without labor and struggle, there would be no transformation or achievement. The progressive history of humanity that follows the expulsion from Eden can be understood in this light as the story of consciousness evolving through successive stages toward higher integration and unity. Cain and Abel represent the first division of labor, the first emergence of specialization and social complexity. The Tower of Babel represents a moment when emerging human civilization reaches a critical complexity and consciousness fragments into diverse languages and perspectives. The covenant with Abraham represents a moment when consciousness begins to recognize its relationship with the transcendent principle beyond itself. The law given at Sinai represents the codification of moral consciousness, the establishment of ethical frameworks to regulate the interactions of increasingly conscious beings living in increasingly complex societies. The prophetic tradition represents the emergence of individuals who achieve higher states of consciousness and attempt to transmit the awareness achieved in those states to the larger community. The apocalyptic visions at the end of the Hebrew Scriptures represent a vision of ultimate transformation and unification, where all consciousness returns to the cosmic source, perhaps in a state transformed and elevated by the journey it has undertaken through matter and time. In this evolutionary understanding, the sun god's final meal represents the meal consumed at every moment of transition and transformation, the nourishment that consciousness requires to undergo metamorphosis. At the moment of birth, the newborn consciousness, descending from spiritual realms into material incarnation, requires nourishment. At the moment of initiation into mystery cult mysteries, the consciousness undergoes transformation and requires the sacred food that enables this transformation. At the moment of death of the physical body, the consciousness requires the knowledge and the nourishment that will enable it to navigate the realms beyond matter and continue its cosmic journey. In the ultimate final transformation, when the individual consciousness returns to the source from which it emerged, unified with the universal consciousness that transcends all separation and individuation, the final meal is consumed, a nourishment representing the completion of the cosmic journey and the achievement of ultimate liberation. The practices maintained in mystical Christianity, particularly in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, appear designed to cultivate this state of conscious participation in cosmic transformation. The practice of theosis or deification through participation in the Eucharist and prayer represents an understanding that the ultimate goal of the Christian life is not merely salvation from punishment or acquisition of virtue, but rather the progressive transformation of the human consciousness into divine consciousness, the gradual dissolving of the boundary between self and divine. The hesychast practice of combining physical techniques with the invocation of the name of Jesus represents an attempt to induce states of higher consciousness in which the practitioner directly perceives divine reality. The mystical theology of John of the Cross describing the dark night of the soul, through which the consciousness must pass, parallels the initiatory crises in mystery traditions, where the initiate must experience ego death and the dissolution of all ordinary reference points before the emergence into higher states of consciousness. The hidden truth that has been maintained across millennia within the mystery traditions and the mystical wings of institutionalized religions is that the universe is a living, conscious, purposeful process. Matter is not inert or dead, but is the materialized expression of consciousness. The human being is not an accident or a cosmic aberration, but is the universe in human form, the cosmos seeking to know itself. The practices and rituals of ancient mysteries, though expressed in the symbolic language of their time, were designed to facilitate the expansion of human consciousness and the recognition of the divine reality underlying and pervading all existence. The forbidden fruit in Eden, the sacred meal in the mysteries, the Eucharist in Christianity, the meditation practices in Buddhism, these are not fundamentally different paths, but are various cultural and historical expressions of a single perennial truth: that consciousness can evolve, that human beings can awaken to their true nature as expressions of cosmic consciousness, and that this awakening is the ultimate meaning and purpose of existence itself. The sun god's final meal, whether in Mithraic sanctuary or in the Christian church in the Eleusinian hall of initiation, or in the mystical vision of the individual, contemplative represents the eternal moment of conscious participation in the cosmic transformation that is the fundamental reality and ultimate destiny of all sentient being. As the sun descends toward the western horizon on any evening, the same cosmic drama that was enacted in Mithraic sanctuaries 2,000 years ago, that was symbolized in the forbidden fruit eaten in the Garden of Eden, that was celebrated in the grain mysteries of Eleusis, continues to unfold in the sky above us with absolute regularity and perfect reliability. The light withdraws, the world enters darkness, and in that moment of transition, the entire cosmos appears to die. Yet this apparent death carries within it the certainty of resurrection. The sun will rise again, the cycle will renew, the transformation will continue. This is not speculation or mystical fancy, but observable reality, the fundamental rhythm upon which all terrestrial life depends and through which all consciousness must pass in its journey from birth through death toward whatever realms await beyond material existence. To understand this rhythm consciously, to participate in it deliberately rather than passively, to recognize one's own consciousness as an expression of the same principle that drives the sun through its eternal journey. This is the essence of the revelation that the ancient mysteries sought to impart. The concept of the sun god's final meal, which appears in various forms across virtually all ancient cultures, and which has been preserved in transformed and often unrecognized ways within the world's major religions, represents more than a quaint historical artifact or curiosity for scholars of comparative religion. It represents an enduring and universal truth about the nature of consciousness, transformation, and the relationship between the individual being and the cosmic whole. The meal, whether understood as bread and wine in Christian Eucharist, as sacred grain in Eleusinian mystery, as the fruit in the Genesis account, or as the cosmic banquet between Mithras and Sol, always functions as the moment of transition, where one state transforms into another, where nourishment is provided for passage through boundaries, where the individual consciousness is aligned with and participates in cosmic processes vastly larger than itself. The consumption of the sacred meal represents the moment when the individual chooses to cross the threshold, to leave behind the familiar securities of ordinary consciousness, to accept the burden and gift of expanded awareness. The progression through the mystery initiations, from the lowest grades involving purification and preparation through the middle grades of knowledge and practice to the highest grades of union and liberation, describes a journey that every conscious being must undertake, whether it is formally recognized and supported by institutional mystery traditions, or whether it occurs spontaneously and individually within the context of ordinary life. The journey begins with recognition that the world as one has always understood it is incomplete, that there are realities and dimensions of experience beyond the ordinary scope of material perception. This recognition is the first threshold, the first moment of transgression against the comfortable illusions of unconsciousness. To cross this threshold requires courage, for one must accept that everything previously assumed about the nature of reality might require revision. The middle stages of this journey involve the acquisition of knowledge and the development of practices that allow the consciousness to perceive and access realities beyond the material. The practices may vary: meditation, prayer, sacred sexuality, ritual consumption of plant medicines, artistic creation, or deliberate ethical action. But all are designed to shift consciousness from its ordinary material-focused state toward increasingly refined and expanded states of awareness. The knowledge acquired is not merely intellectual, but is understood as lived experience, as the direct perception of truths that cannot be adequately conveyed through words or concepts. The mysteries taught that direct personal experience of cosmic and divine reality is possible, that such experience is available to anyone willing to undertake the necessary preparation and practice, and that such experience transforms understanding at the deepest levels. The final stages of the journey, whether understood as the highest Mithraic initiation, or as the mystical union described in Christian contemplative theology, or as the enlightenment sought in Buddhist practice, involve the dissolution of the boundary between individual consciousness and universal consciousness, the recognition that the apparent separation between self and other mind and matter is ultimately illusory, that all existence is an expression and manifestation of a single unified reality. At this point, the question of what one eats becomes almost irrelevant, for the individual consciousness has transcended the need for material nourishment in the ordinary sense. The food consumed is pure consciousness itself, the direct presence of the divine principle, the substance of reality itself. The individual has become a conscious participant in the cosmic process of creation and transformation, rather than a passive subject undergoing creation. The persecution of mystery religions by Orthodox Christian authorities, and later by secular authorities, did not ultimately eliminate the truths that these traditions preserved and transmitted. Rather, these truths found new vehicles of expression, new institutional frameworks through which they could be maintained. The contemplative traditions within Christianity, particularly in the Eastern Orthodox Church, preserved practices and understandings that connect directly to the pre-Christian mysteries. The Kabbalistic tradition within Judaism maintained esoteric teachings that encoded the same cosmic principles visible in Hellenic and Near Eastern mystery religions. Islamic Sufism developed mystical practices and understandings that parallel those found in Christian mysticism and Hindu yoga. The indigenous shamanic traditions of cultures worldwide have maintained practices for millennia that achieve the same basic purpose: the cultivation of higher states of consciousness and direct perception of the spiritual dimensions of reality that underlie material existence. What appears as a diversity of religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, indigenous shamanism, and others, can be understood at a deeper level as various cultural and historical expressions of a single perennial human aspiration to expand consciousness beyond its ordinary material-focused state, to perceive the reality that underlies material manifestation, to experience union with the transcendent principle that animates and pervades all existence, and to understand one's own consciousness as an expression and manifestation of this transcendent reality. The surface differences in theology, ritual practice, and institutional organization often mask a profound unity of purpose and understanding at the mystical and esoteric levels. The differences arise from different cultural contexts, different historical moments, different climates and geographies, but the fundamental spiritual orientation remains consistent across these variations. In the contemporary moment, when traditional religious institutions have lost authority and influence in many parts of the world, when material science has provided mechanistic explanations for natural phenomena that previously seemed to require theological interpretation, the ancient truths preserved in the mysteries remain no less relevant or essential. Indeed, they may be even more necessary. The modern secular worldview, for all its contributions to material comfort and technological capability, has largely lost the understanding that consciousness is the fundamental ground of reality, that the universe is a living, purposeful process, rather than an inert mechanism that individual human consciousness participates in and contributes to cosmic processes, and that the development of consciousness represents the ultimate meaning and purpose of existence. The scientific exploration of quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and cosmology increasingly reveals phenomena that the mechanistic worldview struggles to accommodate and that appear to align more closely with the esoteric understanding preserved in the mysteries. The recognition that consciousness cannot be adequately explained as a mere byproduct of material brain function, that consciousness appears to have a fundamental and irreducible role in the structure of reality, that individual consciousness appears to be connected to and participate in a universal consciousness field underlying all manifestation. These insights, emerging from contemporary scientific investigation, validate perspectives that the mystery traditions have maintained throughout history. The mysteries have always taught that consciousness is primary, that matter is secondary, that the universe is organized around the expansion and development of consciousness. Modern science, in its careful investigation of the nature of physical reality, is beginning to circle back toward perspectives that the ancients understood experientially and encoded symbolically in their religious and mythological narratives. The practice of regular consumption of a sacred meal, whether in the form of Christian Eucharist, mystical Muslim practice of remembrance of divine reality, Hindu puja, or worship involving offerings and sacred food, Buddhist meditation with sacred substances or shamanic consumption of plant medicines in ceremonial contexts, continues to serve the same function that these practices served in ancient times. The meal is not about physical nourishment in any primary sense, but is rather about the conscious alignment of individual consciousness with cosmic processes, the deliberate participation in transformation, the incorporation of divine principle into one's own being through the substance consumed. The food consumed is understood as containing or as being an expression of divine presence, and to consume it consciously is to deliberately align oneself with the cosmic principle of regeneration and transformation. For the contemporary individual seeking to understand and engage with these practices, the first essential step is to recognize that the ancient mysteries are not merely historical curiosities or objects of academic study, but are living traditions that continue to transmit genuine wisdom and offer genuine pathways toward expanded consciousness and spiritual development. The second step is to recognize that such development is not the privilege of membership in exclusive organizations or the result of special dispensation from religious authorities, but is potentially available to any individual with genuine aspiration and willingness to undertake the necessary practice and transformation. The third step is to begin a practice, whether formal meditation, contemplative prayer, study of sacred texts, participation in genuine mystery traditions that continue to exist, or development of artistic or ethical practices designed to cultivate higher states of consciousness. The specifics matter far less than the fundamental commitment to conscious development and the willingness to allow one's understanding of reality to be transformed by direct experience. The sun continues its eternal cycle of descent and ascent, death and resurrection, withdrawal and return. At every moment, countless beings exist at different levels of consciousness, undergoing initiations at different stages of development, consuming at their appropriate level the nourishment that enables their continued transformation. Some beings remain trapped in material illusion, conscious only of physical survival and the satisfaction of bodily desires. Others have begun to awaken, to sense that there are dimensions of reality and consciousness beyond the material. Still others have achieved higher states of consciousness and are working to develop further, to advance toward the ultimate goal of complete liberation and cosmic consciousness. All of this occurs simultaneously. All of it is necessary. All of it represents the universe in its process of knowing itself through the expansion of consciousness across all levels of being. The ultimate revelation of the mystery traditions, the final truth that the highest initiates were said to perceive, is that all of this, the cosmic cycles, the transformation of matter, the evolution of consciousness, the individual life stories and struggles and achievements of countless beings, the apparent conflicts and contradictions and sufferings that characterize existence, is simultaneously a perfect unity, a single, seamless whole animated by a consciousness that transcends and includes all individual consciousnesses, that is developing itself through all of these apparent separate processes, that is simultaneously the source, the process, and the goal of all transformation. This consciousness, understanding itself through the billions of individual perspectives of individual beings, is continuously consuming the meal of its own existence, absorbing its experience, and transforming into ever more complex and subtle forms of awareness and being. The individual human being, in their own small scale and limited capacity, participates in this cosmic process through the expansion of their own consciousness, through their willingness to cross thresholds, to consume the forbidden knowledge, to undergo transformation, to die to lesser versions of themselves, to be reborn into greater versions of themselves. The ancient truth about the sun god's final meal, hidden for millennia within the sanctuaries and the esoteric traditions, preserved in transformed and sometimes unrecognized form within the world's major religions, continues to offer its revelation to any who have eyes to see and ears to hear. The meal is always being served, the invitation is always open, the threshold is always present for any consciousness willing to cross it, the transformation is always possible for any individual willing to accept it. The final destination, the return to the cosmic source with consciousness transformed and elevated by the journey through matter and time, awaits all who awaken to their true nature as expressions of cosmic consciousness on a journey toward higher integration, greater awareness, and ultimate liberation. In every moment of conscious alignment with this reality, in every deliberate participation in the processes of transformation, in every consumption of the sacred food that nourishes the soul's journey, the ancient mysteries continue their eternal work of awakening human consciousness to the cosmic reality of which it is always already an integral part, always already participating in, always already becoming. This is the hidden truth. This is the final revelation. This is the sun god's eternal meal, forever served in the present moment to all who are ready to partake.